Welcome all students, parents, teachers, and our guests to our presentation this afternoon. Our speaker is a former journalist whose articles have appeared in magazines in the UK, the Netherlands, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. She has written extensively on human rights issues and is a human rights activist, having worked for Save the Children and the UN Office of the High Representative. She is currently working for the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Her responsibilities in this position are to ensure smooth communications between the tribunal and the Serbian government, as well as communicate and maintain relationships on behalf of the tribunal with NGOs, embassies, and other organizations. An important part of her work is outreach to the Serbian public, and that is the reason that she is here today. I'd like to introduce Ms. Morgiana Brading.
Thank you very much, Mr. Karlbeck. Thank you everybody for being here today. It's a huge audience. I will start by just really quickly introducing our little office in Belgrade. I don't know if any of you knew that the Hague Tribunal actually had a small office in Belgrade. It's been here since 1999. We have a small team of people, a couple of investigators, a number of translators, and a couple of us who do outreach and media work. Our major task is really to make sure that the tribunal and Serbian government and other Serbian authorities like police and the prosecutors talk to each other, and that it happens quickly and in time. So all correspondence goes through our office, all requests for assistance, like for example if a court here in Belgrade dealing with a war crime issue wants to look at our evidence in a particular case that might be helpful, they can ask us and we can make sure that they get it as soon as possible. If they want to interview one of the indicted people that are sitting in a detention unit in the Shevenigen, they can also request that through our office and so on. And vice versa, if Hague needs any information from Serbian authorities, we make sure they get it. But the part I enjoy the most is talking to local communities in Serbia. For the past 3 years I've been visiting Serbian high schools, talking to your counterparts about the issue and sharing this presentation. So I don't know if any of you actually know much about the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. It was established in 1993, so during the war, the conflicts in the region were still going on. The UN got very interested in the situation in the former Yugoslavia as early as 1991 and started to follow the reports of conflicts and fighting very early. I think some of the first pictures that shocked the world appeared in 1992 by Guardian journalists who had photographs of inmates in camps in Bled and Bosnia. Those really shocked the world, and I think after that the UN decided to send a group of experts to the region to come up with a really detailed report on whether actually these crimes and violations of international humanitarian law were really taking place. So the expert committee submitted their report in 1992, which is on our website. It's a very detailed report. It talks about camps, it talks about mass murders, mass rapes, deportations, and other crimes. And both the EU and the UN made several calls to the national authorities in the former Yugoslavia to start prosecuting for these crimes, to start investigating these allegations and bringing to justice those responsible. Unfortunately, with the conflict going on, no country in the region was ready to even start thinking about that. That's why UN basically decided to establish the tribunal on May 21st, 1993. And this was actually the first ever international tribunal in history, the first attempt at proper international justice. It's important to say But our mandate was temporary. We were established as an ad hoc institution, which meant that we always knew we were not going to be permanently open. We had an expiry date that had to be decided soon. And for that reason, we were only allowed to prosecute the highest-ranking officials who were accused of the most grievous crimes on the territory of former Yugoslavia, starting with January '91. So that's very specific. We couldn't go after anybody who was alleged to have committed crimes before that. We couldn't go after groups of people. We only had a mandate to go after individuals. Our mandate is also very specific in terms of crimes that we can prosecute for. And those are the four listed here. We, for example, could never prosecute for trafficking, organized crime, and things like that. It was very specific. I don't know if you've ever had to talk about Geneva Conventions, or you know what topics they deal with. Does anybody know? Any future lawyers? Geneva Conventions basically define the groups of people that have to be protected during war. They define very specifically people like prisoners of war, wounded people, sick people, who cannot be legitimate targets at any point in time. Civilians also are never a legitimate target. It also talks about objects that can be legitimate or illegitimate targets during the war. Does anybody know what would constitute a legitimate target at the time of war? Does anybody want to take a guess? Yes?
Sorry.
What about objects? Can you think of any objects that... I said if anybody could give me an example of a legitimate or an illegitimate target during the time of war. What would you think?
Oh, sorry. So I said pretty much infantry, soldiers, the ones involved in war, non-civilians. As structures go, maybe barracks or any type of military structures. I guess the civilian ones would be...
What do you think about bridges and infrastructure like that? Roads, factories?
Those were illegitimate.
They're legitimate?
No.
No. It's a really tricky one because they can be legitimate, but they don't have to be. It depends what they're used for. Hospitals are usually illegitimate, obviously, targets. But if you can prove that during the time that you attacked the hospital, it was actually working on producing a weapon of mass destruction, then it would be a legitimate target. Obviously, soldiers are a legitimate target, but if you have prisoners of war, you also have rules on how to have to treat them, and they stop being a legitimate target. So it's a very complicated issue in legal terms, and when you're trying to prove any of these crimes, lawyers have to go in such detail to actually prove that what was done was illegitimate, the target was legitimate, and so on. May I just say, if anybody has any questions at any point in time, you can always stop me. I prefer to kind of have an interactive presentation, so if anything springs to mind, if there's anything you want to know about Tribunal, just raise your hand. I really don't mind. Or you can wait until the end.
So you're basically saying that at the time. So any target that could imply any danger to one country could be described as a legitimate target?
It's not simple as that. You have to prove that it was obviously a danger that was specifically being used for a specific attack that was going to have certain consequences on possibly civilian population or a legitimate target. So like I said, even a hospital, which normally you're not allowed to attack, can become a legitimate target if you can prove that it's helping the overall war strategy.
only look at the Balkans or other territories as well for war crimes?
The Tribunal only has jurisdiction over the crimes that took place in the Balkans, so the countries of the former Yugoslavia. It was the first such international tribunal, but after its opening, there were a number of other international tribunals, like, for example, courts in Rwanda, Cambodia, Sierra Leone, Timor-Leste, and today, I don't know if you know, we actually have a permanent international court in The Hague, which opened in 2002, and the idea is that this court is going to have jurisdiction over any conflict in any country that is a signatory to the statute, and all these other ad hoc tribunals, including ours, over time will close and finish the work because they only have mandate over one specific conflict or one specific territory.
And what's the time period that you can try the crimes? Is there like 20 years or 10 years, or is there a certain period of time you can...
I'll actually come to that in my presentation with the authority. I actually raised that issue. I'll explain it. Okay? So, apart from Geneva Conventions, we can also prosecute for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Would anybody know what the difference between these three categories is? What differentiates them? What do you think, for example, is a heavier crime? Or the heaviest? Genocide. Why would you think genocide? That's true. I mean, that's how media usually present that, and to a certain extent, in legal terms, it's very true. I mean, the simplest way to explain it is that war crimes are considered crimes that you don't necessarily have to connect to an overall, like, war strategy at a really high level. They can be, say, killings in one village that you can't really connect to a strategy that was planned at the highest levels. It's a one isolated attack. If you burn them down the village, you will go after people for war crimes. You can't really charge them with anything more than that. In order to charge somebody with crimes against humanity, you have to prove that they were part of a much bigger strategy that was basically organized at the highest level, at the government level. And you have to connect it to other crimes. And all those crimes together kind of had one aim. Genocide itself is only one kind of crime against humanity. Whether it's the worst, I don't know. There's a huge debate in the legal community now, international legal community. Some scholars are even calling for the whole term genocide to be abolished because it's very difficult to define it. Although there is a UN Convention on Genocide, it doesn't really define the crime very clearly. It doesn't state, for example, a number of people you have to kill to prove that you committed genocide. So we've had cases before the tribunal where we've charged a person for genocide and they only killed 13 people. And we obviously had charges against those who committed crimes in Srebrenica who killed hundreds of people. How can you do that? And before the tribunal, because it was the first international court, there was no blueprint. Like, international law was not very developed. So we kind of were at the forefront of developing all these practices and dealing with these new issues. And there was no practice, no legal practice in how you go about charging somebody for proving genocide. And as I said, the UN Convention is not very helpful. What our lawyers and prosecutors have decided to do is that what you have to prove in order to prove that somebody committed genocide is the intent, that you actually had the intent to annihilate a whole group of people, whether it's an ethnic or religious group from a certain territory, or that you put them in such living conditions that over time they will all die out. So you don't even have to kill them, but you have to prove that a certain group was put in terrible living conditions, which would mean a certain death at some point in time, and a disappearance of that group of people. So, for example, we had a case from Brčko. There was a camp guard, Goran Velesic, who was charged with genocide, and we could only prove that he killed 13 people, although he was boasting of killing more than that. And we also had many genocide indictments for crimes in Prijedor in Bosnia, because there were several camps there, and over 5,000 people were killed in Prijedor, for example. And then, of course, we have Srebrenica. And to this day, we only have one conviction for genocide, and it's in the case in Srebrenica, one of the generals on the ground who was actually there, so far has the only conviction. The others partly escaped being convicted for genocide because they pleaded guilty. And when you plead guilty and admit to your crimes, you enter into an agreement with the prosecutor, and you have to give them all the information you have about the crimes, the victims, and other people that committed crimes at the same time. So in return for that, you can ask them to drop certain charges from your indictment. And obviously all these people who were charged with genocide were cleared of genocide because it was the harshest charge in their indictment, and that's how they got away. But it has proven that you can go after somebody for genocide even if they only kill one person, and that's really important.
I don't think I captured that last bit. So people that admit that they've done genocide, they've committed that crime, are not being prosecuted for genocide anymore?
No. Sorry, maybe that's not clear. So, what you can do when you're convicted before the tribunal, you can plead guilty. You can say, yes, I did everything you're accusing me of. Or you can say, I admit to have done certain things in the indictment, but the other things I didn't do. And then you enter into discussion with the prosecutor. And if you give them relevant information about what you did, then the trial chamber will decide how helpful you were, and based on that, they can drop some charges. And in some cases, the charges of genocide were dropped because they were the harshest, and obviously the indictees didn't plead guilty to genocide. They said, we did this, that, and the other, we committed war crimes. So their sentences were always a bit more lenient if they pleaded guilty. But for example, what I can tell you, how sometimes it's difficult to follow law. The general who was convicted of genocide in Srebrenica was sentenced to 35 years in prison. And the camp guard in Brčko, who pleaded guilty to the crimes and killing 13 people in Brčko, he got 40 years in prison still. But he wasn't convicted of genocide. So sometimes there's just no logic, but his crimes were considered harsher. He actually himself said before the trial chamber that he had the intent to eradicate Muslims from the Brčko area. He called himself Serb Adolf. He really was full on in the courtroom and said that's what I wanted to do, that was my intention. And I think that's why his actual sentence was much harsher.
Criterion on how much are they going to tolerate one's actions based on the information he gets, or is it just an arrangement that it's not supported by anything? I mean, is it just?
I think each trial chamber in each case, there's 3 judges presiding over each case. Basically, they decide how helpful. Once you plead guilty, they decide how helpful your information is based on what the prosecutor tells them, based on the information that you provided. They will decide, and then in their judgment, they will say whether they took it into account or whether actually, even though you pleaded guilty, you didn't really help. So your sentence will probably be harsher. That's kind of how it works. So to move on, I was going to just mention a few of the main achievements of the Tribunal. We've now been in existence for 20 years, and we've been working on trying to define our legacy, which is huge in many terms. And there are a couple of things that we're particularly proud of. One of them is that we were the first international court that was not a victims court. We really tried to involve victims and give them a platform to speak and tell their stories. We're trying to give the trials a human face, which we were hoping would contribute to reconciliation in the region. We were also giving a chance to victims to face the perpetrators in the courtroom and speak up and say what happened. So far, we've had over 4,000 witnesses go through our courtrooms. Some of them are factual witnesses, witnesses who actually lived through the horrors and the crimes and who survived the crimes. We've had experts in various fields and also support persons. Another thing that we're very proud of is the fact that we've kind of started the whole end of impunity. We've really proven that it doesn't matter how high a person is ranking at the time, you can still prosecute them for war crimes. And we're the first court, for example, to go after a sitting head of state at the time. We've gone after generals, we've gone after ministers, and hopefully we've proven that this kind of behavior, even if you are a high-ranking official, is not appropriate, and you can't get away with it just because you have a title. And I think that's something that other courts that came after us really confirmed. And hopefully this will serve as a deterrent in the future warlords and people of high ranking who think they can hide behind their title and behind a strong network of helpers. It's not going to be so easy for them. Tribunal has, in its time, indicted 161 persons. I think so far we've completed 64 people have been convicted, and around 20 have been acquitted of the crimes. At the moment, the total is 1,000 years of imprisonment, and we have only one life sentence at the moment. We have one first instance life sentence, but that might be changed in appeals. And that is the longest sentence that we can actually impose. Another thing that we think is very important, what we've managed to do with our work, is establish facts beyond reasonable doubt, which write a part of the historical record of what happened in the Balkans. We obviously can't claim that we are writing the full story, and we obviously haven't dealt with all the crimes that took place, but the facts that we've proven and the stories that we've heard really do tell almost complete story of what was going on in the Balkans in the 90s, and that is something that's invaluable, not just for the region, but also for the world, for people who are studying, for academics, for future generations. And also these facts are hopefully helping fight denial and revisionism in the countries in the region. This is something that's quite strong at the moment. But hopefully the facts that remain in the archives of the Tribunal will be there and talk about what happened. As I said, we've actually contributed to the development of international justice so much that I think in one of the recent conferences I've heard somebody say that the ICTY has developed international law more than in the 20 years than it actually was developed in the 500 years before its existence, which is a huge achievement. Following the ICTY, there was a number of other ad hoc tribunals for a number of conflicts until in 2000 2002 International Criminal Court was set up in The Hague, which will stay as the only permanent to deal with future conflicts in case that national courts are not capable or don't want to prosecute war crimes. Because the idea is that national courts should always take part and prosecute for the crimes in their territory or in conflict that they took part in. And international courts are there only to step in if that does not happen at the national level. An important contribution is also to the local judiciaries. I don't know if you know, but Serbia has a local war crimes prosecutor and a Department of War Crimes since 2003. We've helped them set it up, we've helped their staff with a number of trainings, we help them today with providing materials, evidence. Basically, Serbian law says that any evidence that was used in the trials before the tribunal can be used in the trials in the Belgrade court. So whenever they need this information, we provide it. And obviously, we will keep helping. This is one of the possibly most interesting things, or I find it the most interesting, that sexual violence was never considered a war crime until the ICTY. Rapes and mass rapes kind of followed conflicts throughout history. They happened always, but they were always seen as spoils of war, something that happens just because of the tense situation, but it's not part of the overall war strategy. What we've actually managed to prove and worked hard on is to prove that actually rape and other forms of sexual violence can be part and are part of overall war strategy. And we've proven that in a number of cases, especially in Bosnia. We, for example, established that sexual violence can be part of torture. We've had a number of cases in the Bosnian town Foča, where a number of girls, as young as 12, were imprisoned and enslaved and used as sexual slaves for months, sometimes even years, and then sold on to other soldiers. We've also prosecuted for sexual violence against men in camps in Priedo. Actually, our very first trial dealt with this crime. What is interesting is that our sister tribunal, Tribunal for Rwanda, has actually handed down a sentence for sexual violence as a crime of genocide. And this is the first in history. This is something that we're all very proud of. We don't have one yet, but both Mladic and Karadzic have those charges in their indictments, and it is still possible that we may also have one of those convictions. But that remains to be seen. And obviously the permanent court in The Hague has sexual violence in its own mandate, so it can prosecute for these crimes as well. And there was a question about the timeline and when we're going to finish. So basically, as a lateral institution, Tribunal, pretty much from the beginning, had to file reports to the UN every 6 months. And in 2004, the UN said, we want to start thinking about closing down. And the first thing that they told us is that we had to stop raising indictments. So as of 2004, we couldn't charge anyone anymore. So the last indictments were raised in 2004, and most of them relate to crimes in Kosovo. Another thing that we had to do, because our workload was huge, we had so many complicated cases of high-level officials, we decided to pass on some of our cases to the courts of the region. So 13 entire cases were sent to the court in Bosnia, 1 case was sent to Croatia, and one case was sent to Serbia. And the last thing that happened is that in 2010, UN adopted Resolution 1966, with which it basically decided to close down the tribunal. But keeping in mind that we are not able to finish all our trials by 2014, which is when they wanted us to finish, because our last fugitives were caught only last year, and the trials have only just started. What's going to happen is that basically, Tribunal, as we know it, with its 1,000 employees in The Hague and 4 regional offices in Serbia, Zagreb, Belgrade, and Pristina, is going to close down in December next year. But we will still have ongoing trials and appeals, and people serving sentences, which is something we still have jurisdiction over, and so on, and witnesses and protection programs, some for life. So the United Nations has told us to create a body that they call the residual mechanism, which is a horrible name that none of us like. Hopefully it will find a better at some point. But basically, what it's going to be is a smaller institution that's going to employ between 50 and 100 people who are going to be tasked with finishing our work. They're not going to be able to raise new indictments. They're just going to finish the trials, finish the appeals, and take care of the enforcement of sentences. I don't know if you know, but Tribunal has agreements with 17 EU countries where people convicted go and serve their sentences. They all have a right to ask to be set free after 2/3 of sentence served, but the decision is always that of the President of the Tribunal, and that decision will fall of the President of the residual mechanism in the future, for example. And then there's the whole issue of protected witnesses that this body is going to have to also take care of. And it was decided that the archives of the Tribunal will remain in The Hague within the jurisdiction of the residual mechanism. I hope that answers the question. Yes, please.
Can I ask a couple of questions about the pie chart?
Of course you can.
Slide before.
Okay, can I just ask you to have a microphone because I can't really hear you as well.
Could I ask a couple of questions about the pie chart that you had on the screen?
Of course, we do that too.
Of those indictments that were withdrawn or the accused deceased, how many of those are actually deceased?
How many?
How many of those were actually deceased? The indictments withdrawn or accused deceased?
You're just asking about how many were.
Yeah, I'm just curious about the numbers as well.
6 or 7.
I think 6 or 7 deceased.
Okay. And those people at large, is that before or after?
Yes, that's a new one. There's no people at large anymore. That was just Margaret and Hadji at the time. I haven't corrected that slide yet. So no, we don't have any fugitives at large.
Thank you.
Any more questions at this point? If not, I was just going to go into a few cases before the tribunal. One of the first trials before the tribunal was to Dušan Tadić, who was a camp guard in one of the camps in Serbia. You can see on the map, here is a town in Bosnia. There were several camps around Prijedor where non-Serbian population was kept and treated accordingly. And it's one of the cases where we had a largest number of indictments, but also a largest number of guilty pleas. This was important. Although the convicted people possibly got more lenient sentences, the information that they provided in return was invaluable because it helped us then uncover other crimes and gather information, gather evidence. One of the complexities that was presented to our investigators is that, for example, they couldn't come to investigate any crimes and incidents in the region until the signing of the Dayton Agreement, so 95. And even then, there was resistance from many authorities. And basically, it was a number of years before our investigators were able to go to the crime scenes. So you can imagine that things change, evidence disappears. So getting information from people who were there, who know what happened, was invaluable. And this is what happened in Belgrade, for example. Sarajevo was a multi-ethnic city, which is important to say, and it was under siege for more than 3 years, and it's the longest siege of a capital city in modern history that we know of. Some of the figures, I mean, basically, I think around 11,000 people were killed during the siege. And obviously, our city was besieged because it's in a valley surrounded by mountains, and Bosnian Serb army was surrounding the city and basically attacking the civilian population daily, shelling the city and with sniper fire. The interesting thing I can tell you is that the only life sentence we have so far was handed down to General Stanislav Galic, who was the commander of Romania Corps, and he ordered the shelling of Sarajevo. We have 2 further convictions for these crimes. His successor, Dragomir Milosevic, got 29 years for his crimes, and General Perisic got 27 years first instance trial last year for his basically providing help to Serbian forces. We also had a case that was dealing with a camp set up by foreign fighters, foreign Muslim fighters. There was a division called El Mujahideen that was based close to Tribunal in central Bosnia. They set up camps where they basically inhumanly treated and beat Bosnian Croats and Bosnian Serbs. Now what happened is that ICTY went after 2 generals in the Bosnian army who basically had control of that area. It's a trial to Enver Hoxha-Hasanovic and Amir Kubura. There were 2 Bosnian generals, but they were prosecuted not for the crimes, because they didn't commit the crimes, but they were prosecuted and convicted for the fact that they didn't stop the El Mujahideen setting up camps and killing prisoners. So they were prosecuted based on their command responsibility. And they were both convicted. Srebrenica you probably have all heard about. It's the only genocide conviction we have so far, although many people have called for crimes in Prijedor also to be classified as genocide, because more than 5,000 people were killed. We still haven't managed to prove that. We've only so far proven that what happened in Srebrenica really was genocide, because the figure we have is that more than 8,000 men and boys were killed in the space of a week. I can tell you, I don't know if any of you have been to Potocari, to the memorial center where bodies are buried every year. I think at the moment there's just over 6,000 men and boys have been identified and buried. So each year they identify and bury more people. But at the moment there's just over 6,000. Zagreb was another capital city that came under attack. We've convicted Milan Martic, a Bosnian Serb, to 35 years for ordering the attack, which he actually himself confirmed on national TV and before the tribunal. It was an unlawful attack because it was retaliation for a previous operation by Croats. And international law, revenge or retaliation is not really a legally accepted term. Basically, revenge is just not legitimate. You can't. What I often hear, for example, when we talk about Srebrenica, people say it was revenge for the killing of a number of Serbs in battles and before that, but revenge is not a a legitimate legal area. Another case, just from Zagreb, is the city of Vukovar, which was taken over in '91. Shelled, hundreds of people were killed. But what the trials that we held were mostly for the people that were taken from the hospital where they were hiding, including wounded people and sick people, who were later killed in Ovčarka and buried in a mass grave. Vasiliy Ivanchev is one of those convicted for those crimes. He was first convicted to 17 years, but got the sentence reduced to 10 years last year, and he came back to Belgrade last year and has since published a book about his time in the detention unit. Operation Storm is one of our later trials. Basically, it deals with the number that we're dealing with is around 200,000 Serbs were deported from Croatia, or forcibly deported from Croatia. Croatian army basically in '95 decided to launch two initiatives to free up two parts of the territory that were under Serb control, and they successfully did so. One of those operations was Operation Storm, led by General Ante Gotovina, who was handed over to Tribunal in 2005, and who was convicted last year to 24 years in prison, together with Markac to 18 years in prison. But I have to stress that these are so far only first instance verdicts, which means that appeals are now ongoing, and we expect a final verdict at the beginning of next year. And in the end, I will just mention that we did have a number of cases related to conflict in Kosovo, which was the latest conflict. The red dots you see are the crime scenes that we investigated, and we've had a number of trials. For example, to Haradinaj, General Đorđević, General Šajnović, but unfortunately none of those trials are finished, so I have no verdicts or facts to give you yet. I think I will finish with that and leave you guys some time for questions, if you have any.
If possible, it would be good just to go back a little bit to the notion of genocide, because it's something that comes out very often in our diploma history courses for grades 11 and 12. I don't teach anymore, but I do remember very, very heated up discussions. So when we learned about, when we teach the notion of genocide, we talk about the end of World War II and when genocide was restated as a crime against humanity, and we say that was because the Third Reich had a final solution that was a governmental policy to exterminate the whole nation of Jewish people. And from that, if we stick to that definition during the Nuremberg trials, it would mean, especially Serbian kids ask, you know, what do we have now the proved intention by the Serbian government to exterminate the Muslim nation? So how would you clarify, please, is the Tribunal of The Hague now moving towards the intention of the individual person, like the one that you mentioned for Brčko, because his intention was definitely augmented, and he was convicted of genocide? Or how is this debate international, so we can go back to our students, especially when they write essays? It is something important because they need to talk about different interpretations in their essays. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really complicated one. As I said, even in legal circles, there are many divisions, and some of the recent writings that I've seen, there are some scholars that are even calling for the entire term to be abolished from legal practice because it's just too confusing. The tribunal never had a jurisdiction to go after a group of people, so we certainly cannot say that just because we have a conviction of genocide in the Srebrenica case, it means that the entire Serbian government or Serbian people are guilty of genocide. Our purpose actually was to give perpetrators a name and to, so as to avoid kind of a group guilt, and especially younger generations who have nothing to do with what happened in the 90s, you certainly can't say that they're guilty of such things. There is a category in the ICT bylaw called joint criminal enterprise, with which you basically, when you're going after high-ranking officials, in order to prove that there was a strategy on a really high government level, you have to prove that those people somehow were connected and that they were all working on the same plan. And that is something that is incredibly difficult to prove. And that doesn't only apply to genocide, that applies to crimes against humanity as well, which is basically the same term. If somebody is accused and convicted for crimes against humanity, people think somehow they committed something less bad than genocide. But if you killed one person, is it worse than, or better than killing 100? I mean, you still killed someone, you have to live with that, and somebody's not alive because of what you did. So, crimes against humanity also mean that somebody or a group of people have taken part in killing or torturing a huge number of individuals. And that's no worse or better than genocide, basically, in those terms. Genocide is specific only in as much as you have to prove the overall plan was the intent to kill or set up such living conditions for a group of people that you knew were going to basically lead them to death and eradicate that group. Now that group doesn't have to be religious, it can be an ethnic group. It can apply to any group of people. And like I said, it's complicated because we've only gone after individuals, but at higher levels you also, in order to prove something like crimes against humanity, you have to connect the people and you have to connect the fact that they had the same aim. So everything that was done on the ground by the lower level soldiers, who were most of the time really young, in the mid-20s, they were following orders, and most of the time they were not aware of the greater strategy. So this is why we really went after the high-ranking people, and this is why we have this category of joint criminal enterprise. But again, even that is only referring to a group of people that were connected. It doesn't refer to a whole government or to a whole nation. Absolutely. And you can't prove that if we couldn't do that before 40 years of that. I hope that helps you.
In thinking about the legacy, I'm over here. In thinking about the legacy of the courts, I could see where it could be, it would really help in Bosnia, where a lot of the crimes occurred. But in thinking about Belgrade and Serbia, where not much happened here during the war physically, what are the benefits of this court in all of the trials and all of the information for Serbia and as a region as a whole as you're going forward now? In the next 10 to 20 years or so?
That's a good question. I think the first thing that springs to mind, I think what's really important is the fact that for Serbia, we really have gone after individuals. We all know about Mladic, Anadžić, and so on. And I think that helps talk about individuals who committed crimes rather than an entire nation. And I think this is the question I'm often asked. People say, in Serbia, people say ICT is anti-Serb. In Croatia, we're anti-Croat. In Bosnia, we don't care about the victims because the sentences are never long enough. So I think for Serbia, what's important is to stress that we went after individuals. And just because those individuals happen to be Serbs and have committed crimes, doesn't mean that the whole nation needs to feel guilty or that people in Bosnia have to accuse the whole nation for what happened to them. I think it's really important to put the names out there and we know who did what. And The other thing that I think is really important, I know that not many crimes took place in Serbia. A few did, although we didn't prosecute those crimes, but the local prosecutor obviously hopefully at some point now. What I'm often asked in Serbian schools is what about the NATO bombing? Because people did die. We do have buildings in the center of town that still stand today as a reminder. What I can tell you, what I do tell them, we did investigate what happened in detail. And there is a very detailed report on our website somewhere that talks about each particular case, each particular bombing, each particular building that was knocked down, and the people that were killed. And basically the short of it, that our prosecutor, having received a number of materials and evidence and having listened to a number of witnesses in regards to these bombings, decided that there was just not enough material to raise indictments. There was not enough proof that actual war crimes took place. What they saw was that basically the targets that were hit were legitimate targets, and the deaths that occurred were legitimate collateral damage. They were not purposefully aimed at. That's the short of it. It's a very long report to summarize it for you. But that doesn't have to be the end of the story. It doesn't mean that our prosecutor was right. He may or she may not have had all the evidence before her at the time. The local war crimes prosecutor is able, and it's in his jurisdiction, to also investigate these crimes and can raise indictments if he feels he has enough evidence. Just so you understand, before the tribunal, in order to raise an indictment, the prosecutor obviously goes in the field, collects evidence. When he thinks he has enough evidence to raise an indictment, he needs to present all that evidence and the charges he wants to raise to a chamber of 3 judges, who then have to sit down and look at all the evidence that he has and the charges that they want to raise and decide whether there's actually enough material. And they decide whether the indictment can be raised. So it's not up to the prosecutor.
Are there any other questions? All right, so as on behalf of the school, I'd like to thank you, Morgiana, for coming on. All right, and that wraps up the day. It's almost 3 o'clock, so you guys are dismissed.